Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to break down the 5 biggest things that I've learned about compounding interest or the compound effect that have helped me build a top 10% net worth and just improve my life in general. And honestly, while the compound effect and compounding interest have been talked about so much in our society recently that it's honestly kind of cliche, people are probably so used to hearing it that they just gloss over the things that actually are super important about it, that really make it work and really make it pop into your favor. And so that's my goal, is to cover the biggest things that I've experienced that have really made the difference, that you don't think about when you're starting out, that have really helped the most. So let's get into it. The first concept is time. And time is the biggest bitch when it comes to getting compounding returns, right? Anybody who's tried to get into better shape, right? They definitely understand this. You know, I've been out of shape at different points in time in my life, and when you want to get back into shape, you know you got to go to the gym. And so you start going to the gym and you go the first week and like, man, you feel like you're killing it. You go 4 times or 5 times or maybe more, but honestly at the end of the first week there's no real difference other than you're sore as shit. Expand it out for another week and another week and another week, and you've done a month. And there's still no meaningful difference. And you're like, man, this is really frustrating. Like, I've put in some serious effort, dedicated, intentional work, and just no gains. But play it out long enough, and that's where that's where you get those big returns, big results that you're looking for. The thing that sucks is you got to hang in there. Another example of how time can be very annoying is, especially if you're an entrepreneur or you have lofty ambition or some goal that you're trying to accomplish. So you start out, especially if you're in your early 20s, you just graduated from college, maybe you're starting a business or something like that. You're starting out and your friends get these jobs, go do cool things. They're going on these vacations, they're going on these different trips, they're living in cool cities, they're doing these, all these extravagant things. They finally got somewhat real money, somewhat to go and do things, and you're sitting there working your tail off to maybe make just as much as them, but yet you invest that all back into your business. It goes back into what you're doing, into building up your skill sets. And the fact that you don't have the immediate result, even though your intention is there, it allows doubt to creep in. You start asking questions like, is this even worth it? Going back to working out, is this even worth it? I'm not seeing any results, right? And so time is your biggest asset. It's also the biggest bitch and the biggest place where you're going to ask, is it worth it, and have some doubt. Moving on to rule number 2, the Pareto principle. If you've listened to Jordan Peterson, you've probably heard him talk about the Pareto principle. Or another way to say it is that success breeds success. It's also called the 80-20 rule. And it means that 80% of your output is produced by 20% of your employees. It's also seen in nature as well, where 80% of all fresh water is found in 20% of all freshwater lakes, or 80% of mass of stars is held by 20% of the stars, or it could be applied to cities, that 80% of the populations are found in 20% of the cities, and so on and so on. Actually, the New York Times did an article, and this is to the extreme, and this gets back to the point that success breeds success. So once you start having success, you'll start having more. The New York Times had an article where they said the 8 wealthiest people in the world had the same amount of wealth as the bottom 3 billion people. Now, I haven't fact-checked this. I don't know if this is 100% true, but it's pretty crazy to think that 8 people could have the same amount of wealth as 3 billion people. But it's actually a natural effect. It happens in nature. It's just how things go on. Now, how does the 80-20 rule apply to compound interest or the compound effect? It's that 80% of your gains or your bang for your buck will actually be found in the last 20% of the time, right? So a great example of this with compound interest in terms of investing and building wealth comes back to Warren Buffett. A textbook example. Today, Warren Buffett's wealth is about $100 billion. But the crazy thing is that nearly $90 billion of this was made after he turned 65, so retirement age. That means the vast majority of this dude's wealth was made certainly within the last 20% of his investing career. And why is this important? If you realize that in the back half, that's where I get all my gains. That once you start getting that success, you realize, man, I need to hammer down even harder, not pull back off. If you're having a portfolio and your portfolio is finally starting to grow the way that you always wanted it to grow, maybe when you started out, that's the time to push harder, not to pull back off, because that's your exponential growth phase. And the more you push hard on that, the more you're going to get that exponential growth. So don't work all that time to finally get what you dreamed of, and then boom, it's you sabotage yourself. Rule number 3 is that interest rates or effort exerted have a non-linear impact. And the backstory on this is when I was driving quite a few years ago, and I realized I wanted to be a professional investor, I said, okay, let me look at the amount of wealth that I have today, and what would it be if I just got a 10% return, right? I was in my 20s, but we can say 25 or something like that. And so I calculated out what it would be at 10% in 40 years by 65, right? 65 was the retirement age. I was like, okay, that's interesting. But if I'm a professional investor and I'm like building up the skill set and putting all my time and energy and effort into this, I certainly should be able to do better than 10%. So I said, okay, what's a very reasonable return that I think I could get if I was a professional investor, did this full time, and so on and so on. And I said, okay, 15%, I should be able to do that consistently minimum, right? And it's pretty interesting because from 10% to 5% or 15% is a 5% increase, only 5%. Or you could be like, well, it's actually 50% more, and you'd still be wrong. Sure, it's 50% more, but like the impact, you would be very wrong. So the math here works out something like this. Say you had around $25,000 and you're 25 years old and you invest it, you're able to get 10% per year for 40 years till the time you're 65. That works out to being something close to $1.1-ish million. Well, what if you kept the scenario the same and you changed one thing? It's just the interest rate. And you went from 10% to 15%. The difference goes not 50% more, it becomes 600% more. A $25,000 investment invested at 25 years old that averages 15% annual rate of return for 40 years turns into a $6.6 million return. And it gets even crazier than that. If you take and add 2 more percentage points, so if you go from 15% to 17%, your return turns something to like $13 million. So a 13x, nearly 13x increase over the 10% return. But think about, if you're not going to think about investing, think about effort into something. If you just give 1% more effort over time, how much more does that compound? How much more does that give in a net result? Multiples more. Not just a little bit more, multiples more. It makes sense, right? Because compound interest is an exponential function, right? Or an exponential expression, right? So you have some amount raised to a power, right? And so maybe math is not your specialty, but that's how you get that curve that goes like that. That's why the 80-20 rule that I was talking about is super important to understand, that most of your gains will happen in the back half, and that little tiny increases to an exponent have massive results. Moving on to point number 4, where you start matters. It's very important that you start, but where you start matters. And the greatest example of this actually comes from a CNBC story that I ran across when I was doing my background research for this video. And they were talking about Warren Buffett and his wealth. He's a textbook case study of compound interest and investing and everything like that. So it makes sense. And this CNBC ran this thought experiment on what if we changed a little bit of the variables, and what if we changed where he started. So I'll read it to you. It says, Buffett began seriously investing when he was 10 years old. That's not exactly true. He got interested in investing when he was 10 years old, but he also went to college and then went to grad school at Columbia University, etc., and then he was older than 10, but I digress. By the time he was 30, he had a net worth of $1 million, or $9.3 million adjusted for inflation. But what if he was a more normal person, spending his teens and 20s exploring the world and finding his passion? And by age 30, his net worth was, say, $25,000. Now, I did a rough adjustment to what $25,000 would be if you started out today, and it's like $225,000. And that is very doable. By 30 years old, to have $225,000 of a net worth, that's so doable, it's not funny. If you're not there, don't worry, but you should get on it. Like, you should definitely be able to do that. You should definitely work very hard to getting it because it's super important. Continue on with the thought experiment. And let's say he still went on to earn an extraordinary annual investment return. He was able to generate 22% annually, but quit investing and retired at 60 to play golf and spend time with his grandchildren. Now, here's an important thing that they really messed out, and it goes back to that Pareto principle. He retired at 60. 65 is the retirement age. That's 5 years. We'll come back to how much of a difference that 5 years makes. What would a rough estimate of his net worth be today? And they go on to say not 81 billion, but 11.9 million, which is 99% less than his actual net worth. Now I want to backtrack a second and go back to that 60, that he retired at 60. The truth is, you probably wouldn't retire at 60 if you really understood compounding interest, or you wouldn't stop having your investments really work for you, right? So let's actually play it out to 65 and give him back those 5 years and see how much they are. So if he retired at 60, according to CNBC, he'd make $11.9 million. That'd be his net worth. But in reality, if he goes to 65 and we keep everything else the same, his net worth goes to $32 million. Or in other words, those 5 years gave him $20 million more dollars. That, my friends, is the Pareto effect, or just the exponential effect that comes from compounding interest. But it really hammers home the importance of your results are back-weighted. Anyways, there's other things that you could say, like retiring at 60 to play golf. Doesn't sound super fun. Grandchildren, that sounds awesome. That sounds fun. That sounds pretty cool. But teach them how to invest, maybe. I don't know. Moving on to point number 5, in the last point in this video, which is the opportunities you take on are super important. Referring back to the story from point number 4, 22% annual return is actually incredibly difficult to get, if you probably didn't notice. Very, very difficult to get. But it comes back to something that Warren Buffett actually said himself, and actually most really successful entrepreneurs who have built huge companies talk about. And it's how hard you row isn't as important as the boat you are in. A great example of this from my life, or when I think about this and apply it to my life, I think about when I was in college and I had an internship with a commodity trading company. And I wanted to be in commodities, or I thought I wanted to be in commodities in college. And so I went and worked for them. There was only a set number of hours that I could work per week. So it was essentially like I had a salary. And I like working. And I noticed that my friends who were working hourly jobs, they could work more than 40 hours a week. They could work 60 hours or more. And so they were making 50% more if they were ambitious, skilled, and were willing to put in the work. And it started to click with me then that not all opportunities are as good as they're talked up to be, right? If you're in college right now and you've heard that, oh, going and working for a, say, Fortune 500 company, that's the thing to do, or salary is the greatest thing in all, or greatest thing ever. You need to get a salary, but you're really ambitious, you're willing to work really hard, you're willing to work long hours. Be very careful about the salary. Not really getting into the details in that, but more so of make sure that the opportunity you're taking on has the payout that you're looking for. Honestly, eventually I figured out that wasn't really what I wanted to do, because it didn't have the payout that I was looking for. It wasn't going to give me the life or the business or the ability to own my own business if I continued down that path. And ultimately, that's why I changed. A good thing, though, to understand is that your opportunities are going to change throughout time as well, right? So when I first got into investing in real estate, the first property that I ever bought was a single family rental. It was like $46,000. Now that really isn't going to move the needle, except when I was in that stage, right? When I was in that buying my first rental property, because I was afraid. I didn't have the confidence to go out and buy a property. I really didn't know what I was doing, and it was actually pretty darn low risk. I mean, if you mess up a $46,000 property that was actually in pretty good shape and rented, then you got bigger issues, right? It's a lot different than messing up a $480,000 property, which was the next property that I went on and bought. But if I didn't do that first property, which was the opportunity at the moment, I wouldn't have got to that $480,000 property or the properties that I'm doing today, which are much bigger. But now that I'm into the opportunities today that are much bigger, I don't go back to single family rentals. And the reason I don't do that, reason I don't go back, is because it takes the same amount of time, same amount of work, and yields a smaller result. I can do the same amount of time, same amount of work on 100 doors in one transaction, then I can put the same amount of work and energy into one door. And so the opportunities that I'm chasing now are much more impactful, or they have more leverage. Don't confuse it with like debt. Debt ratios don't really change, but the impact, end result on my life or the people who are involved is much greater. Anyways, I hope these insights that I've stumbled across provided you with some value. If they did, hit the like button and subscribe button, and I will see you in the next one.